Okay, I think there are still a few people coming in, but let me start with the proceedings. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to welcome you at the Ars Institute this afternoon for our panel discussion on corporate responsibility and accountability in the context of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which is also co-organized with the Jean Monnet Center of Excellence on Corporate Sustainability and Human Rights from Wageningen University, and Olena is representing the center on the panel. I'm Antoine Duval. I'm a senior researcher here at the Ars Institute, and I coordinate our work in general on business and human rights. And we're very honored and happy to have with us His Excellency Andrei Kostin, Ambassador of Ukraine, who will deliver the opening remarks to the discussion. And grateful for our five speakers actually, but the fifth one is not visible on the screen yet. Kindly accepted to join us today to share their views. I'd like also to say a few words of thanks to our team for helping putting together these events, and in particular to my former intern now, and our colleague Dmitro, who will be co-chairing the discussion with me, and who has been instrumental in putting this event together from a substantial and organizational point of view. And I'm quite proud of this achievement, because this is also why this institute is here for. It is to train the younger generation to become involved in this type of discussions and become able to put them together and work out an important subject. And I think Dmitro is a good example of what I would say is the good work we do with training our interns to transform them into what we call junior researcher, but that's just the beginning. And I will leave also to Dmitro the responsibility to provide a deeper introduction to the topic, but I will say a few words from my point of view of why I think, oh my God, this discussion is more important than ever in the context that we are living in today. In the context almost of today, in the sense of the conflict in Ukraine and the ongoing war in Gaza, which represent to me litmus tests for the relevance of the business and human rights idea and practice. They raise fundamental questions. First, what type of business activity, if any, can be conducted by a company in Russia and Israel without being linked to the ongoing human rights violations occurring in Ukraine and Gaza? Can and are mandatory human rights due diligence framework, like the CSDDD, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, which is still in limbo at the EU level, be effective in stopping business activities that are directly linked to human violations in Ukraine and in Gaza? And at which point can we say that doing business is not neutral anymore, but a form of passive complicity with violations of international humanitarian law? These questions are not new. They are with us at least since World War II, but they are more relevant than ever right now. And the turn to human rights due diligence in the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights was supposed to, in the words of Ruggie, bridge the governance gaps opened up by globalization. Well, a big question will be, has it succeeded to do so when we look at what happened in Ukraine and what is happening in Ukraine and in Gaza right now? And I now hand over the floor to Dmitro.
Good evening, everyone, and very warm welcome to the Ars Institute. It's truly a pleasure to see so many of you here this evening. Thank you, Antoine, for kind words. It's really touched me, and it was pleasure to be with you all here today. So as he mentioned, we will focus on the role of corporation within the armed conflict setting and the broader theme of corporate accountability. So as mentioned, the timing for this conversation could not be more urgent. With the renewed peace talks earlier this August, the international community is once again confronted with the dangers of impunity. So this raises critical questions. To what extent those who remained on the Russian market enabled or fueled aggression? And what lessons could we learn from this situation for the future of corporate accountability? And it's important to mention that the earlier days of full-scale invasion, the corporate complicity was a topic of a heated debate. So many multinational, predominantly Western companies faced unprecedented pressure from civil society, customers, and governments to take a stand. Yet, as the war has dragged on, this urgency has sometimes faded. It is therefore essential to revive and deepen this discussion, not only to hold accountable those who have enabled or profited from aggression, but also to shape the norm for the future. Our conversation tonight is also forward-looking. Beyond the immediate challenges of accountability, we must also think about the role of business and the potential post-war recovery of Ukraine. So we are fortunate to have these remarkable group of speakers with us, each bringing a unique expertise and perspective to these special issues. I will not take up more of your time because, of course, the most valuable insights you'll hear from them. But before that, I'm happy to announce we have His Excellency Ambassador of Ukraine to the Kingdom of the Netherlands with us. And before I will invite him to provide you with a keynote speech, I would like to share with you a condensed version of his biography due to the time. His Excellency Andrei Ostin was elected to the Ukraine's Parliament in 2018, where he served as the Deputy Chair of the Legal Policy Committee and chaired the Subcommittee on European Court of Human Rights Judgment and Alternative Dispute Resolution. From 2020 to 2022, he chaired the Legal Policy Committee and then served as a Prosecutor General, overseeing national and international justice matters. Since then, he was appointed by the presidential decree as Ambassador of Ukraine to the Kingdom of the Netherlands and the permanent representative of Ukraine to the OPCW. Your Excellency, the floor is yours.
Good evening, dear ladies and gentlemen, and of course I'm always happy to be here at ASER and hope that we will have time to talk about the variety of aspects, how war of aggression impact life of people, how it impact changes in politics, in business, how difficult it is to be prepared for such a brutal war, how difficult is to understand the unbelievable variety of heinous crimes committed in course of this war of aggression, how difficult it is to resist, how difficult it is to keep resilience and unity of society, how difficult it is to keep unity of countries and nations who share the same values of freedom, democracy, human rights, and how important it is to talk and to communicate between us, to talk and to communicate with people in different countries, to not only to end this brutal war, not only to deliver justice and accountability for hundreds of thousands who suffer from this war of aggression and international crimes committed in course of it, and how important is to prevent, to deter repetition of the same pattern of brutal criminality, how important is to involve everyone in this fight for better future, for long-lasting peace. We are not naive. We understand that this pathway will be a difficult exercise, but it's important to talk, it's important to communicate, it's important to reach the hearts of the people, because even today, if we are talking about business, business is about people at the end of the day who work in this business, who lead this business, who are shareholders of transnational companies, who are customers of this business, because really everyone now matters and everyone is touched by the war of aggression of Russia against Ukraine and many other conflicts which are going on in the other parts of the globe. Well, today, and I again thank you, we have an opportunity to talk on a topic of profound importance: business and human rights in times of war. For decades, the global community has worked to establish a framework of corporate social responsibility, guided by principles of due diligence and ethical conduct. We have discussed, debated, and developed guidelines. Yet, in the aftermath of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the ground beneath this framework has shifted dramatically. This war of aggression has not only shattered the peace in Europe, it has fundamentally transformed the landscape of business and human rights. What was once seen as a soft law issue, a matter of corporate goodwill and reputational risk, has become a question of moral clarity and increasingly legal complicity. The invasion has forced us to confront a new, grim reality that in a conflict of this magnitude, companies are not neutral actors. Their decisions, whether to stay or to leave, to profit or to divest, have a direct and measurable impact on the lives of millions and on the trajectory of this war. This brings us to the urgent issue of corporate complicity. We have seen a strong initial wave of solidarity from many multinational companies, which rightfully suspended or exited their operations in Russia. The global sanctions regime led by the European Union, United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and other our allies has been critical in this effort. However, the picture is not as clear as we might wish. A significant number of international firms, including many with headquarters in Western countries, have chosen to continue their operations in Russia. Their reasoning often centers on maintaining a presence for future profit, protecting local assets, or providing so-called essential goods. These justifications, while appearing sound on the surface, fail to address a deeper moral and financial reality. These companies continue to pay corporate taxes, which directly fund the Russian state's military budget. The revenue and profit they generate in Russia, billions of euros, are not simply a matter of business as usual. They are direct financial lifeline to a regime committing genocide and war crimes. This is the very essence of indirect sponsorship of war. When a corporation pays taxes to an aggressor state, it's not merely being compliant with local law. It is providing the resources that are used to purchase the very weapons that kill Ukrainian children and destroy our cities. The fact that the company is sanctions compliant is no longer a sufficient defense. The new standard must be one of moral and ethical compliance. We must ask ourselves, is it acceptable for a company to be part of the economic ecosystem that underpins a state's ability to wage an illegal war of aggression? There are two aspects there. The first is clear. If a company violates or circumvents sanctions, this is not only unethical, it's a matter of criminal liability. But the second aspect is more subtle and in some ways more troubling. When companies continue to operate in sectors not formally covered by sanctions, such as agriculture, telecommunications, or pharmaceuticals, they may be legally compliant, but they cannot escape moral responsibility. Because morally, it is simply not acceptable to cooperate with Russia, to be present in its market, or to pretend that business can continue as usual with a terrorist state. Ukraine is convinced there is no future in the Russian market, not only because it is unacceptable to cooperate with aggressors and war criminals, but also because in the long run, companies will lose more by staying than by leaving. To be a good faith actor, to be on the right side of the history, means making the principled decision to exit Russia today, not tomorrow. This is why it is important to reflect on how we approach corporate accountability. Relying only on the discretion of individual companies may be not enough. Thoughtful legal frameworks can help ensure that businesses act responsibly, even when their involvement is indirect or connected to contexts where international law may be at risk. Meeting this challenge calls for leadership from policymakers, engagement from civil society, and a strengthened sense of responsibility within business community. The goal is to move from simply avoiding harm toward playing an active role in fostering peace. The Netherlands has long been a leader in the global conversation on corporate conduct and human rights. We have seen this commitment in the Dutch government's policies and in the actions of many of local forward-thinking companies. We would only hope that our Dutch partners will continue this leadership. Let us work together to ensure that no corporation, no matter its size or influence, can profit from genocide and war. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador, for these important insights and for setting the tone for this, I would say, crucial discussion in the current times. And now I would like to give the floor to Antoine to present our speakers and our panel. Yes, please.
Not sure where I left them. So, thank you so much, Your Excellency, for these words. I think you're very much setting the scene for the discussion. Very much setting the scene for the discussion, also because you're putting in relation different issues. The question of morality, of ethics, and the question of law. Question of what are the responsibilities in legal terms of corporations, and what are their societal responsibilities. And I think we are going to discuss both aspects also with the panel. And let me now introduce our 5 speakers. I'm not sure whether we can have Marina Kupchuk, whether we can see her on the main screen. Ah, yes, thank you. Now we can see you. But let me start with Eva Gritze, who is a project lead on business, conflict, and human rights at PAX since 2021. And you've worked before for PAX in South Sudan and in Congo, in the DRC. And you are basically working exactly on the questions that we are going to be discussing today, the norms, policies, and practices that should be put in place to promote responsible business conduct in conflict-affected settings. And the idea is also to have a bit of a comparative perspective on conflict-affected settings, not only speaking about Ukraine, but other settings. Our second speaker, Olena Uvarova, is the head of the International Lab on Business and Human Rights at Yaroslav Mudry National Law University in Ukraine. I hope my pronunciation is not too bad. Since 2018, and you have been also a member of the law group at Wageningen University as a fellow or as a researcher since now June 2022. So you're also present here in the Netherlands in the academic community working on business and human rights, and obviously you have an intimate connection with the Ukrainian context. Our third speaker, Ela Skibenko, I hope it's also all right. You're a senior researcher and representative for Eastern Europe, Central Asia at the Business and Human Rights Resource Center since 2008. I think you have been at the center. And you've been working on, in particular, what the ambassador just mentioned, also identifying, following whatever was happening in terms of the companies that are involved, still involved in Russia, still doing business in Russia, and reflecting on their responsibilities from the perspective of the center, which is an NGO. For those who do not know, in this field it's very rare, Business and Human Rights Resource Center. It's an NGO that is based, I think, in London, and which provides a lot of information on all the spectrum of business and human rights matters to the community. And then we have also Walid Mahmoud, who is a doctoral fellow at Ghent University and a visiting researcher at the Arts Institute since 6 months now. 4 months, yeah. And where you contribute in particular to the work in the research trend on in the public interest, accountability of the state and the prosecution of crimes, focusing on corporate criminal responsibility with regard to war crimes. And here we are again talking more about the hard law side, and the hard law side in terms of criminal law, which is different issues than civil liability of corporations who are involved potentially in Russia or in Ukraine in this context. And then our final speaker, Marina Kupchuk, I also hope the pronunciation is not too bad, and feel free to correct it, is a deputy head of the Division for International Investment Cooperation and the Promotion of Socially Responsible Business at the Ministry of Economy, Environment and Agriculture of Ukraine. And we'll be looking forward to getting your perspective from the Ukrainian side on, again, business responsibilities for corporations, not Ukrainian corporations, but corporations outside of Ukraine involved potentially in businesses in Russia or connected to war crimes linked to the Russian invasion. Okay, so the first in line, and I hand over to Dmitro again to introduce a little bit how we have thought about the discussion, and then we get into the matter.
Yeah. Thank you, Antoine. So the scheme for our discussion, which we planned, is to look specifically on the corporate accountability from a general perspective, what are avenues and regulations which might be present or might not be present or changing due to omnibus process, how it can impact on the corporate accountability and from which perspective. Then we were going to look at the due diligence process, specifically within the Russian aggression against Ukraine context, what can be the distinction drawn between those companies who are working within the Ukrainian market and Russian market. And then we are going to move slowly to the question on the linkage of companies with the ties or operations in Russia, how and to what extent they allegedly might be linked to war crimes committed by Russian army on the territory of Ukraine, as well as the issue of the corporate responsible exit concept and what UN guidance is on that. And then we will reflect on the past experience from the after World War II, specifically military trials and other mechanisms, which often went beyond just the criminal responsibility perspective and what can be the insights for our current discussion. And lastly, we will gonna look on what will happen next. I hope, luckily for us, that those and perhaps maybe other private entities, to what extent they can be linked to reconstruction efforts and what role they might play, if any role. So with that, I'm gladly and happily want to ask our first speaker, Eva Goritze, to start our amazing discussion. So thank you, Eva, and the floor is yours.
On, yes. Thanks so much for the introduction, and thanks for inviting me to join this panel. So I work for PAX, which is a Dutch peace organization, on indeed the topic of business conflict and human rights. We work together a lot with local civil society organizations and affected communities on specific cases of corporate abuse in different countries, supporting their efforts to access justice and remedy. And next to that, we advocate nationally as well as internationally for better policies and practices in the field of responsible business conduct in conflict-affected areas and corporate accountability. I was asked to present a more general introduction or framework into this topic, and I'll do that also by drawing a bit into PAX's line of work. Considering the increasing number of armed conflicts in the world and the increasing protractedness also of these conflicts, more and more businesses find themselves operating in conflict-affected areas or linked to these areas through their upstream or downstream business relationships. Well-known examples, of course, already from the 90s, early 2000s, are the implication of extractive businesses in resource-rich areas, which have been conflict affected, like in the DRC, Colombia, Sudan, but also Sierra Leone and Myanmar. Fast forwarding, there's been, as already mentioned, a surge of attention to the issue since the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine. And most recently, an increasing recognition of business implications in the Israeli occupation of Palestine and the genocide in Gaza. So, as recognized in the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, businesses operating or having business relationships in conflict-affected areas are at a heightened risk of becoming involved with severe human rights abuses. This is because these kinds of contexts are inherently rife with negative impacts on human rights. Business relations, like local suppliers, can be active parties to the conflict. The government can be unable or unwilling to protect human rights, or is also an active party to the conflict. Also, the management of these risks is harder due to the inherent sort of like complex operational environment. And companies can, in these contexts, also unintentionally exacerbate pre-existing grievances or conflicts, or even create new ones. So in short, as also His Excellency already pointed out, a company's presence and its activities in these contexts never take place in a sort of like isolated bubble, right? They're never neutral bystanders. They will always have an impact on the conflict as well as vice versa. So to effectively address these heightened and also specific risks, the UN Guiding Principles as well as the OECD guidelines make explicit that heightened action is needed in these areas. So for corporate actors, this means conducting heightened or conflict-sensitive human rights due diligence. This means that in addition to identifying human rights risks and impacts, companies need to identify and address adverse impacts on the conflict and ensure that they do not cause or contribute or are linked to conflict. What this comes down to, very briefly is that companies should conduct conflict analysis, integrate this into their human rights due diligence process. So they need to map the root causes, triggers of conflict dynamics, the actors, and then they need to assess how their own presence and their operations or the services they provide, as well as their business relationships, are impacting the conflict, as well as vice versa. This is analysis that needs to be regularly updated, right, to account for the inherently dynamic context. And it needs to be based on broad and robust stakeholder engagement, including with actors that are specialized in the context and in conflict. This should then inform actions aimed at preventing, contributing to conflict, in addition to the management of human rights impacts. And this, importantly, also includes proactive early considerations regarding a potential exit and how to do that in a responsible way. This means carefully assessing and mitigating the potential human rights impacts of exiting to prevent exiting either too hasty or too late. And I think the next panelist will delve deeper into this issue of what is a responsible exit for the Ukrainian as well as Russian context. Then importantly, and in addition, companies whose activities are linked or closely linked to an armed conflict or occupation, they need to respect the standards of international humanitarian law in addition to human rights law. I'm not a lawyer. I also don't have a legal background, so I'll keep this a bit short. But for example, in situations of occupation, business responsibilities mirror those of the occupying power. For example, when it comes to the use of private property, the exploitation of natural resources, the displacement of occupied population, and the transfer of the occupying power's population into occupied territory. As laid out most recently, again in Francesca Albanese's report, the UN Special Rapporteur for the Occupied Palestinian Territories, her report on corporate involvement with the occupation and genocide in Palestine, she lays out that the failure to act responsibly in line with international law may implicate corporate entities and or their executives in violations of international law, which in turn may give rise to criminal liability for the corporate entity or its executives. Here in the Netherlands, we've seen 2 cases of supply chain liability for international crimes. Individual businessmen have been held criminally liable for complicity in aiding and abetting war crimes. In the one case by supplying the raw materials for chemical weapons to Saddam Hussein, and in the other case for supplying weapons to Charles Taylor during the Liberian Civil War. There's also cases of corporate actors being held liable for international crimes through cooperating or condoning the actions of governmental security authorities or non-state armed groups with the objective to protect their assets or to protect or to ensure continued operations. Pax is closely involved with the investigation and upcoming trial against US coal mining company Drummond in Colombia, and with the criminal case against former executives of Swedish oil company Lundin in Sweden. And another well-known example, of course, is the case against French cement company Lafarge. On the Lundin case, our 2011, a little bit of background, our 2011 unpaid debt report led to the Swedish prosecutor opening an investigation. Former executives of Lundin are currently being tried with aiding and abetting war crimes during the Sudanese civil war. They allegedly actively requested and encouraged the government of Sudan to clear the oil areas for them, while being aware of how the government conducted these clearances, namely with massive violence against the civilian population living in these areas. I mean, I can talk a long time about this case, I won't do that, but it's an interesting case to follow also in this context, because if the suspects are found guilty, it will be an important precedent for similar cases of aiding and abetting war crimes by corporate executives. And it's also interesting maybe to mention here the company itself is also being charged with making criminal profits, which is another way in which corporate actors can be held liable for involvement with international crimes. So strengthening corporate accountability for human rights violations was also behind the drive for human rights due diligence and related transparency legislation, both on the national level, like in France and Germany and Norway, as well as on the EU level. In July 2024, the EU Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, the CSDDD, was adopted, and the CSDDD obliged companies in the EU of a certain size to identify adverse human rights and environmental impacts in their upstream and part of their downstream value chains, and also to prevent and remediate these impacts. Well, following civil society and academic advocacy from people behind this table, the text also included references to the heightened risks in conflict-affected areas and the need for companies to take these specific risks into account and integrate them in their human rights due diligence processes. Moreover, the directive also introduced an EU-wide civil liability regime that allowed for companies to be held liable in civil courts for harm as a result of failing to fulfill their due diligence obligations. And although much the outcome of political compromising, with a lot of limitations and loopholes and only applicable to a relatively small group of very large companies, the adoption of the CSDDD was generally welcomed as an achievement in the field of corporate accountability. However, since the beginning of this year, in a quite unprecedented move, the CSDDD has been opened up again, following the European Commission's so-called omnibus simplification proposal. Negotiations about a severely watered-down version of the CSDDD are ongoing at the moment, and it doesn't look well. This brings me finally to a few challenges in the field of responsible business conduct, specifically in conflict-affected areas. So what we see happening is, of course, this general wave of deregulation in order to boost industry competitiveness, which includes the breakdown of the CSDDD, but also of other sustainability regulation, including for the financial sector. Instead, much more focus on safeguarding access to critical minerals, which are often located in conflict-affected areas, as well as on massive investment in the arms industry, without properly addressing this industry's impacts and responsibilities, again, in conflict-affected areas. I don't know. Am I allowed 1 more minute, or I can also stop here? 1 more minute. Another challenge that is maybe mostly specific, relevant to the financial sector, but therefore also to the wider field. What we see is that the big ESG data providers, so the companies that provide the data to big institutional investors on risks in their portfolios, that these companies are bending backwards to political pressure. They have announced a few of them have announced that they would stop covering human rights issues in so-called contiguous territorial disputes. And this mainly follows from the years of pressure exerted on these data providers by pro-Israel groups in the US. It also leads to these data providers ending coverage of human rights issues in other conflict-affected or occupied areas, including in Ukraine. That was maybe a bit of a sidetrack, but I think it's an important one that's often overlooked in this field, but quite significant. I'll leave it here.
As we've seen, the normative framework is slightly developing, but also underdeveloping. And as we've seen from the history, were and still are some cases with regards to corporate responsibility. But however, this is still a really beginning field, which is developing. And with all these insights, I would gladly give the floor to Olena Warwa, who presents insights concerning the due diligence application in the context of Russian aggression against Ukraine, what is the distinction, and what are the insights for corporate accountability if we talk about this specific context. Olena, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much. I would like maybe to add one more thing to our discussion, because in any case, when we talk about heightened human rights due diligence, we talk about companies operating in conflict-affected and high-risk areas. and it means that we talk both about countries which operate in Russia, and of course we have the number of issues which we are discussing today about what kind of human rights risks these companies face and what actions they should do to avoid these risks. But also we talk about companies which operate in Ukraine and or those companies which have supply chains in Ukraine. And by the way, Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive was mentioned today, and it's and Eva already shared with you that from the very beginning, the text of this directive didn't include the special provision about heightened human rights due diligence, about conflict-affected areas, and then basically it also shows the importance of civil society organizations, of academia, and as Ambassador told from the very beginning that it's very important to communicate important issues, and civil society organizations took this initiative to communicate how important to include this issue into the text of directive, and with reference to the full-scale invasion, the reference to Ukraine basically was key reason of this communication, and basically unfortunately for us, but the war in Ukraine became this legal background to include this provision into the text of the directive. So in this way, the war in Ukraine already impacted the European Union law, and as from the very beginning, the World War II was mentioned, and we know World War II is a reason of basically of developing the modern international human rights law as we know today, this law. And who knows, we just discussed when this meeting was starting with Ella that we feel in Ukraine, we feel like international human rights law unfortunately is dead. But who knows, maybe the war in Ukraine and the war in Gaza changed the situation, and maybe some other framework and other mechanisms will be created based, unfortunately, on our experience. But go back to your question, Dmitry, about the differences between ordinary or usual human rights due diligence and heightened human rights due diligence. I need to mention several ones. First of course, the general cross-cutting principle of human rights due diligence is contextualization. So we always need to take into consideration this context. And when we talk about responsible business conduct in Ukraine and for companies which operate in Ukraine, of course, they also face with this challenge to take into consideration the context where they operate. And I would say, to be honest, for companies which operate in Russia, their tasks is much more easier because they just need to leave the market. But for companies which operate in Ukraine, the task is much more complicated because they need to take into consideration that they operate in situation of heightened risk for human rights, and the conflict impacts human rights in significant way. And this is the key difference between ordinary human rights due diligence and heightened human rights due diligence in the context of Ukraine, that companies became responsible as much as they can in reasonable way. They become responsible for human rights risks which are beyond of their of their actions. So basically, the war creates risk for mental health, the war creates risk for safety, the war creates risks for physical safety, mental, as I already mentioned, and many other risks. And of course, when just yesterday, unfortunately, we received news from Ukraine that the post service, the state-owned post service company was attacked while this company just delivered pensions for local people because these local people were staying very close to the front line because some people still need to stay very close to front lines. They live there, and this post-service company just provides them with pensions. And they were attacked, and 23 people were killed, including employee was hurt, but in heavy way. And from one side, the most simple decision for all companies just leave dangerous territories and just not taking this responsibility on their shoulders, but from another side, if people stay in these territories for many reasons, then this company need to make this very complicated decision, also stay or leave, but in very different context than the same question we ask companies operating in Russia, stay or leave. So, and this is completely another context, and companies face very, very complicated choice, stay or leave, especially if these companies provide essential goods and services, especially if these companies have employees which for family reasons decide to, for example, to stay or for any other reasons. And another very important point that, again, the general principle of human rights due diligence is the stakeholders engagement. And this is also cross-cutting component of human rights due diligence, of normal human rights due diligence. But in conflict-affected areas, companies are also facing a huge challenge how they can implement this principle of stakeholders, meaningful stakeholders engagement, because they face a lot of challenges how to communicate with employees, with local people, all these human rights risks, how to plan their operations, how to take into consideration what kind of needs these people have, especially, of course, when situation change dramatically. Of course, we experience this in first days, especially in first days of the war, but every time when situation changes dramatically, companies need to react in very quick way, and they need to find a very efficient way to communicate with different stakeholders, and first of all with the rights holders which could depend on from them. This is another point, and maybe the third one about investors. I know that Marina will be talking also about investors, why we need to pay attention about responsible business conduct and the heightened human rights due diligence with taking into consideration all additional risks that the war brings to our lives in Ukraine, why we need to raise this question before investors. Investors are actively involved in conversations about reconstruction of Ukraine, but there is a big question about how this reconstruction will happen, will it happen in a responsible way. And we know that the situation of the war and post-war situation means that many people are in very vulnerable position. We have people with disabilities, we have veterans, we have families who which lost family members, and many other issues. And it's very important to make this message and to create these social expectations, if we talk in UN Guiding Principles language, to responsible business conduct during the reconstruction of Ukraine. I will stop here, and yeah.
Thank you very much, Elena, for these fruitful insights. This aggressive war impacted us, all Ukrainians, in very different ways. And I think it's really crucial to see, and I had a talk with a close friend of mine and a close person to me, that despite these big challenges, we still have businesses working in Ukraine, supporting Ukraine, and trying to do their best to stand to these principles and to UNGPs in a matter, even though some of local businesses might not know what does UNGPs mean. So, but on the other side, we see still big multinationals present on the Russian market, saying that they are supporting the local population with the crucial products and goods. So, and back in the first days of the invasion, there was a big discussion about this, but unfortunately it kind of disappeared with the pace of time. So with that, I would like to give a floor to Ella Skibenko, who will present to us what are the challenges, issues, and big questions of those who are still on the Russian market. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Dmitro, and good afternoon, dear participants. I would like to start by saying that it should be crystal clear to any company that doing business with or operating in an aggressor state like Russia is inconsistent with internationally recognized human rights standards, because it always contributes to massive human rights harms. Over the past 3.5 years, international companies from various sectors have been fueling Russia's aggression against Ukraine, this aggression has resulted in tens of thousands of civilian deaths and many more injuries. Entire cities have been completely destroyed by the Russian army in Ukraine, and still businesses continue supporting these atrocities through taxes they pay, supply chains they support, and technology they provide. Our findings show a catastrophic lack of action by companies. As the ambassador mentioned, thousands, according to our estimates, over 2,000 of international companies continue doing business in Russia. And these companies cannot avoid contributing to the war effort, either indirectly by paying taxes, as was mentioned, that go directly into Russia's defense budget, or directly by helping the Russian government with the mobilization efforts. Companies also risk being accused of complicity in war crimes that range from destruction of Ukraine's critical infrastructure to mass torture and killings. I will start with the taxation issue. Under the UN Guiding Principles, as I'm sure you all know, businesses should pay taxes, including in challenging circumstances. However, by paying taxes in Russia, they contribute to that they are helping the aggressor commit war crimes in Ukraine. Russia's economy is a full-fledged war economy. At the cost of spending on its people, Russia has increased its defense and security spending from 14% of the federal budget in 2021 to 40% in 2025. And in 2025, the corporate profit tax increased from 20 to 25%. Existing guides on heightened human rights due diligence do not mention the taxation issue. The OHCHR, it's called Note on Business and Human Rights in Challenging Contexts, mentions payment of taxes in a footnote number 12 in a section that talks about situations where the government plays an active role in violating human rights. The footnote says that payment of taxes in these circumstances does not on its own make a business involved with the violations of the government regime, apart from exceptional circumstances where a business is a very significant tax contributor to a government that is involved in gross human rights violations. But there is no definition of a very very significant tax contributor in the document, which quite frankly makes this footnote useless in practice because, for example, Raiffeisen Bank paid $402 million in profit tax to Russia in 2024 alone. So the question is this a big enough tax contribution to be able to say that this company is involved with the violations of the Russian government? Because we are talking about over 183,000 documented war crimes committed by the Russian army in Ukraine since the start of the invasion. A few more figures on companies' tax contributions in Russia in 2024. So last year, foreign companies paid $20 billion in taxes, bringing the total since 2022 to more than $60 billion. And this amount is equivalent to almost half of Russia's planned military budget for 2025. Now let's have a look at the mobilization efforts. The Russian mobilization law obliges all companies operating in Russia to assist the Russian government with the mobilization efforts in various ways. This includes delivering the summons from the military to their employees, delivering equipment to military units, providing buildings, land plots, communications, transport, and information. Russian law prohibits companies from refusing mobilization orders or terminating government contracts. Such refusals can result in civil fines, criminal penalties against company executives up to 8 years in prison, and forced performance of contractual obligations by Russian authorities. And there is plenty of evidence that companies are helping the Russian government, they are either helping or being forced to help Putin's war efforts through compliance with this mobilization law. Again, back to the UN Guiding Principles. So according to the UN Guiding Principles, if national laws or regulations require actions that would be inconsistent with internationally recognized human rights standards, businesses are expected to respect the principles of internationally recognized human rights to the greatest extent possible in the circumstances, and to be able to show their efforts in this regard. And the OHCHR note I've previously mentioned on business and human rights in challenging contexts gives an example of a challenging operating context, saying that it may happen where products or staff may be requisitioned for the furtherance of armed conflict, and this is exactly what the Russian mobilization law does. The UNGPs further explain that if a company is left with little room for mitigating its risks of involvement in adverse human rights impacts and addressing them in the manner expected under the UNGPs, it would be appropriate for the company to consider exiting the market. But most businesses present in Russia failed to do so, and companies headquartered in the US and Germany top the list of businesses that decided to stay in Russia. They're followed by Chinese companies. Besides, as I mentioned, Western companies continue providing technology that is absolutely critical for weapons production in Russia, including CNC machines, mostly German. Finally, I would like to very briefly address the concept of responsible exit, as it was mentioned previously. According to the UN Guiding according to the UNDP's UN Guide on heightened human rights due diligence, to exit responsibly, companies should assess whether A, exiting could exacerbate the conflict, and B, whether harms to people outweigh the benefits. Unfortunately, this concept of responsible exit focuses exclusively on assessing harms versus benefits to people in a country from which a company is considering exiting. And this makes perfect sense in the context of a civil war. But if we apply to an international conflict, we'll see that it overlooks the impact such an exit may have on people in other countries involved in the conflict. For example, and like in my opinion, this one-sided, I would say, approach is quite dangerous. For example, in the Russian context, it is hard to imagine, I think it is hard to imagine a situation where local employees would benefit from the exit of an international companies because they would either lose their jobs or they would force worse working conditions if this company is overtaken by a local buyer. But if we look at impacts of such exit on people in Ukraine, we will see that this exit would contribute to saving people's lives in Ukraine. So it's basically lost jobs versus lost lives. Thanks.
Thank you, Ella. And yeah, as we see within one context, there might be different challenges. And yeah, we haven't seen the concrete steps to kind of, so we see the problem, we hear the problem, but we haven't seen the concrete steps to address it. Except I think in March 2022, under French diligence law, there were some formal notice from NGOs to companies, French companies, to comply with their vigilance plans. But it stopped there, I think. Yeah, so here we need to look more in the past and what were the further steps with regards to corporate accountability and what were the mechanisms for that. And with that, I would love to give a floor to Walid to present us with the insights from the past experiences.
Thanks, Dimitro. Good afternoon, or perhaps good evening, everyone. I would like to pick up also from the discussion on corporate responsibility. First, to reiterate that corporations are not only responsible, that's at least my position, for human rights violations, but also for humanitarian law violations and criminal law violations. That's basically perhaps in practice, scholars and also practitioners would look at this with doubt because it's vague, because it's not consistently applied. But matter of fact, if you look at IHL, you would see that non-state actors as well as individuals are responsible basically for any violations, basically or crimes, that they would commit either as direct perpetrators, so for corporations that could be pillage or unlawful appropriation, but also for complicity, and that could be basically any crime that is stated perhaps in their own statute. But what I would like to do is to take a step back and look at things with a more open view and introduce one terminology which is transitional justice. And basically, although I will go back in history, this is more about the future. So we have to imagine perhaps a couple of years from now, maybe for the optimistic a couple of days, maybe a couple of weeks, we don't know. At a certain point in time when Ukraine starts to recover itself, when we look at the situation as already came to an end, where you could see that cities are being rebuilt, investment is flowing in, all these good things are happening. On the surface, you might see that this is a good development. The country is being reconstructed on its way to a specific direction of success. But perhaps underneath, there will be some truth that is hidden. There will be families that still don't know much about the disappeared, tortured people who don't feel recognized for what happened to them, people with disabilities such as those mentioned after the war would not feel acknowledged. So the question now would be to look at two examples, one from the Nuremberg trials. That's a model where prosecutions were the leading model, and the South African model where a truth commission was the centerpiece of the development. and then ask ourselves which aspect. It can be both. Which side of things we would like to focus on. Of course, prosecutions, at least as the Nuremberg trials show, they could have a strong impact. So up until now, these cases are still cited, perhaps in the London case and Lafarge, but also worldwide. So the impact of prosecutions could be strong, could be punitive, could have some deterrence effect for any other company that would perhaps think that it's fine to profit from situations of aggression and etc. So that's one model where prosecutions were the leading component, and at the end of the day, you would see that only 24 people, or Nazi Germany's, were prosecuted, of which 3 or 4 were companies. So this is another point to also linger at, that the birth of international criminal law and criminal prosecutions had corporations in mind. So anyone who would try to make this a bit vague for reasons that we don't know from a corporative perspective, that's not the case. Since the beginning, corporations are as much responsible as individuals. But what happened during the Nuremberg trials, or what happened after, is that these corporations went back to business in perhaps 10 years, 5 years, because Germany prioritized over time economy boosting, of course, trying to get back on track. So that's where the limitation lied. But also some of those corporate leaders, such as Krupp, Fleck, but also who? Yeah, I think so. Farben, right? If I pronounce that right. So eventually they went back to business. Some of them went back to business, and things moved on. And here we ask, is actually prosecution would help us? And this is, of course, a question for future societies in Ukraine to decide whether prosecutions would be the only or the solution for looking backwards. The other downside would be that corporations would be prosecuted in principle, but in practice, there's nothing. So this is the limitation here. The model of South Africa is a little bit more lenient. It looked at things a little bit more differently. There were amnesties. There were truth commissions, so the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which is quite known, which was established in 1994 and 5. And the idea was to look for truth rather than prosecutions. There were prosecutions, but in a context of transitional justice, which basically prioritizes truth, prioritizes healing, prioritizes reconciliation, but also reparations. So ultimately, what this resulted at a report that was published in 2003. It also gave reparations to, it hurt 20,000 people, and eventually it gave one sum or one payment reparation, which was an equivalent of $4,000 for those who testified before the commission, and also allowed access and restorative programs for those who got affected from the apartheid South Africa. So this is another example where we can take a step back and look whether corporations should be included, because also what was a highlight for the TRC was that they conducted what's called industrial hearings, and part of which was business hearings, where they brought companies and corporate executives to light and started putting them on the stand, basically, and then asking them questions. And what was the value of that was that these hearings were public, so many people got to know the specifics of what happened, the truth behind what happened, and this is here really where like procedures at court, but also the setup of adversaries where lawyers try to perhaps argue certain things, prosecutions argue certain things, and then the truth is not really at the center of the inquiry. So, so these are the two examples, but again, for the South African example, there are limitations where the victims eventually felt, okay, we now know the truth, we now know where justice lies, but many of those are not really prosecuted. So what did we gain from knowing the truth? So the truth, although was needed, to some it was perceived as painful, and no retribution was really made. So essentially, it's not up to me to decide which direction future Ukrainian societies would go for, but what we can learn from these two examples, that there are options, there are ways to look at things in a different light, where perhaps we are in a situation, of course, the end of the war, I keep thinking about the escalating, but also the ongoing process in Ukraine right now and the talks. And it's really hard to come to conclusions, but the conclusion would basically, from a transitional justice point of view, would be feasible once the war comes to an end, or the aggression, let me put it this way. So to sum up, I would like to say that for Ukraine, it depends on how the war ends, but also it will be up to the emerging societies. So that doesn't mean that we shouldn't stop talking about it. We should think about it. And this is why these panels are quite important. But ultimately, the future societies will decide which way is best. Corporate accountability at the end must not be a blind spot. Either way, we choose Truth Commission or the side or the path of prosecutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Walid. Yeah, it's really crucial sometimes to reflect on the past, to know how to move forward. And with that, I'm glad to invite for the floor Marina Kupchuk. She will shed a light on what's actually going on with the discussion concerning the efforts to rebuild Ukraine, what role for the private entities can be there, and what can be the challenges and the risk for human rights, if any. Yes, please. The floor is yours.
Good evening. Thank you very much for invitation, and thank you very much for this very important topic for discussion. Actually, attracting investments for Ukraine's recovery and reconstruction now is one of the government's top priorities, as it's key to our country's economic growth and long-term sustainability. At the same time, the focus, we understand that focus must be on responsible investment, because only this approach can ensure balanced and sustainable development. The implementation of responsible business conduct standard is not only a strategic need for Ukraine, but also this is a requirement for our path to European Union integration and the process of accession to the OECD. And we see this as a unique opportunity to rebuild Ukraine's economy on a new foundation, one based on environmental and social standards and full respect for human rights. To attract responsible investment, we definitely need to create conditions and appropriate legislation based on these standards. We also need to create conditions for Ukrainian companies that they could implement RBC into their strategies and practices. Nevertheless, I would like to say that based on our experience, that we have already had discussed with our businesses, I can confidently say that interest from Ukrainian companies, including small and medium-sized businesses, in responsible business conduct is growing. This interest comes from the realities of war, the need to remain competitive, the ambition to enter international markets, and the desire to provide decent working conditions and security for employees. Ukrainian business understands that European integration requires commitment to sustainability and human rights. And moreover, many companies admit that some of the risks and challenges they faced after the full-scale invasion could have been reduced or avoided if they had applied or implement due diligence practices and integrated responsible business standards. And that's why responsible business conduct is not a demand of the present moment. It's also a guarantee of Ukraine's sustainable future. And that is why we must seize this opportunity and do everything possible to promote and implement these standards. And this is exactly what we are working on now. I would like to say that since 2017, Ministry of Economy has been working to promote responsible business conduct standards and practices. But today our role is expanding. We are also taking this responsibility for advancing business and human rights, implementing the European Union Corporate Sustainability Directive, and strengthening corporate sustainability and responsibility in the context of European integration. Of course, in this process, we faced a lot of challenges along with conditions related to Russian attacks, and which we sometimes have to work. But there are some challenges. This is like limited human and financial resources, lack of knowledge both in business and within government bodies, because representatives of government bodies, they work with legislation, they implement this European Union legislation and RBC standards into national legislation. So this problem with lack awareness, it's quite big. Also, the fast pace of reforms also like challenges, because sometimes it complicates timely discussion and agreement on proposals for changes for legislations with interest parties, with all stakeholders. And to overcome these challenges, we have and do our main priorities, which include, first of all, raising awareness among stakeholders. For example, this year, together with our partners, we launched a school for business school for small and medium enterprises and civil society organizations, as well as we launched pilot training course for representative of central and regional authorities. Together with the National Agency for Civil Service, we approved a standard training program on responsible business conduct, which means that our colleagues from different ministries will have these opportunities to study every year, to study RBC standards topic. The second one is creating a platform for stakeholder cooperation, and we know that it's very important to involve all stakeholders in this discussion, in this platform. And for example, this includes some events, conferences, seminars, and expert discussions, which we also had this year related to CSDDD in implementation. And this this give us opportunity to bring together all stakeholders and make some decisions. The second one priorities is, of course, drafting legislation. In particular, we are working now on creating a draft of national action plan on business and human rights. We just have started this work, but this is one of the main priorities. And also we are working on some legislations that we need to implement related with the CSDDD directive. And also we develop a lot of information, a lot of materials and recommendations for businesses. For example, in cooperation with our international partners, we prepare sector-specific guidance for businesses on how to apply corporate sustainable standards. So this is what we are working now. Actually, probably I would forget something, but now with this our process of integration, we actually had a lot of work, but in attracting investments to the recovery and reconstruction, this is one of priorities, and also regarding the role of international partners, I would like to mention that international partners and investors are expected to play a critical, proactive and powerful role in ensuring responsible business conduct standards. Investors have what the United Nations Working Group on Businesses and Human Rights calls an unparalleled ability to influence companies. They can and should make the capital condition on partners in Ukraine adopting and implementing robust RBC policies. And this includes requiring their partners to use tools like BHRC checklist. It can be found on the website of Business and Human Rights Resources Center and was developed in consultation with Ukrainian stakeholders in coordination by Ella Skibenka and Olena Varova to identify and mitigate risks related to labor rights, corruption, and environmental impact. They also can establish effective grievance mechanism accessible to workers and communities, and ensure physical and mental safety standards are met. Collaborating on risk mitigation, the BHRC checklist or any other relevant tool can be used by investors to determine together with their partners in Ukraine relevant human rights risks, to prioritize risks and together develop a plan to eliminate or minimize them. This frames their role as collaborative, not just punitive, working alongside Ukrainian businesses to build capacity. Also, I would like to mention that home states of companies investing in Ukraine's reconstruction, like European Union member states, have a legal obligation to ensure those companies conduct due diligence throughout their value chains. This gives them the power to investigate and sanction companies that fail to uphold RBC standards in their Ukrainian operations. Governments and multilateral organizations providing reconstruction funds or awarding contracts can make adherence to international RBC standards like UNDPs and OECD guidelines a non-negative condition. And I also would like to say that Ministry of Economy, Environment and Agriculture of Ukraine, in partnership with UNDP and other Ukrainian partners and international partners, are organizing the conference on responsible reconstruction of Ukraine with a strong focus on responsible investments. This conference will happen on 16th October in Kiev and online. In essence, international actors are the primary gatekeepers of capital and contracts for reconstruction, and their role is to set the rules of the game, making it clear that access to these resources is contingent on a genuine commitment to RBC. So, thank you very much one more for this discussion. I will stop here.
Thank you, Marina, for your insights, and a round of applause to our wonderful panel. Yeah, as you might heard, there are a lot of challenges within the overarching context of Russian aggression against Ukraine. Some of them can be solved maybe in a few years, maybe in decades. So we have a lot of actors working on that. And with that, we prepared some questions with Antoine, but unfortunately, due to time limits, we won't be able to ask them, but we will give this opportunity to you. And yeah, if anyone have a question, you are super welcome to raise your hand, and either me or my colleague will bring a microphone to you. Yes. Any questions? Yes.
Hi, my name is Aime Yara. I come from Peru. I've been living in the Netherlands for 4 years, and I'm very enthusiastic about the topic of business and human rights. I have a disagreement with something that Elas Kibenko said when she said that the responsible exit of a company, that the company has to exit, let's say Russia or Israel, because they are already committing crimes against human rights just by staying there. But it is also true that Russia has like they don't allow the companies to leave. It's not that easy for them to leave. So how do you think that can be handled? If I am a company and I am not allowed to leave, what is am I also going to be accountable for that, or?
Yes, I fully agree with you. The Russian government has put a lot of barriers for companies that are considering exiting, but there are enough examples to illustrate that a responsible exit is still possible. Companies are still exiting Russia, but it takes, of course, much longer than expected. One example of a Dutch company, Heineken, they announced their exit, I think 1 month after the invasion. And right after they announced their decision to exit, the government started putting all kinds, I cannot make this information public, but those were like very serious barriers. And the company still, after like 1.5 years of negotiations with the government, managed to exit, I think in August of 2023. They sold their operations for a symbolic €1, taking 300 million loss. And as part of the agreement, the local buyer guaranteed that they will keep employed all of the workers that Heineken had for at least 3 years. And Heineken had operations in Russia for 20 years. They owned 7 breweries. They employed around 2,000 people. So it was extremely difficult. But I think if company is willing to make it right, it is always possible. Thanks.
Hello, Hello.
I'm Rethinking, I'm the Civil Aviation Authority of the Netherlands. I'm chairman of the sanctions group in the inspectorate. And so, for instance, we regard companies whether they sell parts of aviation and also maritime and other dangerous goods. But in the aviation department, I hear, all companies are really hindered because they have to keep parts. They're not allowed to sell them. They're not allowed to destroy them. They're not allowed to send them back. So they have to keep it, and some, especially small companies, are really hindered. But what we still at the same time, and now that's banned, is that Malta still made money by selling passports, and in that way, companies just could continue and continue selling parts because they officially sold it to Maltese companies, but actually they were Russian companies, and that still continues. And it's the problem at our part is that it's really complicated. You should speak Chinese, Russian, Ukraine, because you have to consider all the papers, and we don't know how to do it. And do you know in what way we could maybe be helped to do it better? We stop a lot of parts, but we don't know if we do it all.
Technical question. Someone dares?
No, I can't respond because it's a really technical question. I just know that companies, when they are interested to solve even very complicated issues, right, like to ensure traceability of something that they are interested to track these supply chains, they can do this. But when they are not interested, they refer that it's very complicated and so on. But it's just a question of tracking supply chains, and it's possible. No, but unfortunately I can't go deeper because it demands some technical expertise which I don't have. Sorry.
Thank you. My name is Andrei Latsiva. I'm legal counsel in the Truth Hounds organization investigating war crimes. So my question is about how can we work on the traceability and possible accountability of the corporations or organizations who work with some of the parts of Russian mechanisms, for example, such as the Wagner Group, who are operating in a lot of African countries like Mali, Central African Republic, Niger, and other countries, basically exploiting the local population for benefits of the Russian government and also some of the private gains on this, using the port of Sudan, using a lot of the transportations to the ferries in Russian shadow fleet and also other fleets. And as well as there is a Swiss organizations, All Eyes on Wagner, which has published the whole book, only in French and German, but which is making an investigation on the connections of also European organizations who are working with Wagner, for example, helping them take those products which have been produced by the forced labor of the local population in these countries to the European countries. So basically whitewashing these products. So what can we do on the point of traceability of this, and how can we limit these activities, considering that, for example, the nature of Wagner as a group is pretty complicated. If it's not registered under Russian law, if it's not, it's only could be recognized as mercenary only in some contexts. So basically, it's pretty big legal gap on this matter, because, yeah, Russia as a state is understandable, but such, I don't know how to say, parts of the octopus in different contexts. So it's kind of complicated. Thank you.
Maybe I'll take it. So, how to address perhaps corporate responsibility when it becomes so obvious that these violations are happening, right? So, one thing maybe we did not really stress today is that corporate responsibility is a domestic issue. That's the principal foundation here. So each state is responsible to prosecute individuals, corporate actors, maybe executives, someone inside a corporation, the corporation itself in some jurisdictions. So not every jurisdiction have jurisdiction over legal and natural persons, but many do so. So your job, I think, would be to, perhaps I draw one example from my work, because my work is exactly on the situation in Western Sahara. So where there is a situation also of occupation, aggression, et cetera, that happened perhaps 50 years ago. Not so many people know about it, but what the victims do and what the human rights organizations that support them do is that they basically trace these chains of operation, and then they perhaps know that this ship is located in that country right now. So like in 2017 in Panama, but also in South Africa, and then they sue them for criminal and civil liability at these states. And actually, for the situation in Western Sahara, for example, they could capture a ship and give the returns back to the victims, who are about 200,000 people who live in refugee camps in Algeria. So it's a bit of a complicated situation, but that's one example of how you can do it, is basically to go after these corporate actors before domestic laws. And this has been also happening here in the Netherlands with the F-15 and other cases. So maybe this is one pathway, but perhaps you already know that already. Thank you.
Thank you. And it's working. No, thank you. And I think there is a connection between the last two questions. It's the connection that comes through the complexity of the way the economy works and of the way corporations can structure their value chains, supply chains, to hide connections. And that is the problem that you're facing on a daily basis. And that makes accountability, responsibility difficult. But that's also a challenge, I think, and I agree with Olena, that is not unsurmountable. I mean, for governments, for NGOs, there are tools. Some might be, now there are powerful digital tools to trace, for example, links between within a supply chain, to trace, for example, when a particular product is connected to a particular production area. Think of Xinjiang, which can be used very effectively, I think, both by public sector actors and by NGOs, who could use this same type of digital tracing tools to try to figure out a way in that maze, because it's a maze, and it's built as a maze so that you cannot control it. But we have unfortunately already gone over our allocated time, and the Institute needs to close at one point. If not, I will get into trouble. Therefore, I will thank you all for coming. thank again our speakers for speaking, for sharing their views with us. And I will invite you all, I think it's in this room over there, to join us for a small reception with Ukrainian food, as far as I know, with Ukrainian food. So thank you for joining again.